For everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 4, Episode 29 of Surfing the NASH Tsunami. Our coverage of the first 3 days of an amazing EASL Congress 2023 starts now.
Today from EASL Congress 2023 in Vienna on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Now, we're at a point where we hopefully will have a drug, and then we got to know, what does it mean if an NIT changes under therapy, to what extent? Do we continue the treatment, and do we stop the treatment? Is this efficacious for the patient or not?
Any alternative to biopsies in the real world is something that everybody wants to move towards.
This idea that you can, achieve huge reductions in liver fat content readily and quickly is really striking. It gives real optimism for what's going to be possible in the future for patients who've got particularly other metabolic conditions.
You can start to see where big debates are boiling up.
This week, 6,000 members of the global hepatology community came to Vienna, and another 600 joined online for EASL Congress 2023. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Professor Jörn Schattenberg, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and their guests, hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Professor Ian Rowe, and Fatty Liver Alliance President Mike Betel, as they review the first 3 days of this extraordinary meeting, right now on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
As I was introducing us, I was realizing that's going to have to change, because after 10 o'clock this morning, NASH is not going to be the way that we're allowed to officially describe ourselves in these settings. So it will be easy to go to fatty liver, but we were joking at dinner last night, several of us, that we should change the name of this podcast to Surfing the Steatotic Tsunami. And then we will challenge everyone who ever comes on the program to say Steatotic Tsunami 5 times in a row fast, and no one will be able to do it. Just one small thing to keep in mind as we head into the day. It is now 6:15 in the morning in Vienna, which is really early for Jörn. This is his time zone. It's 5:15 in the morning in the UK, where Ian Rowe lives. And Betel and I Mike Betel is from Toronto and I'm from Pennsylvania. We just haven't been sleeping all week, so it's nothing new for us. Good morning, everybody. How you doing today?
Good morning, Roger.
Anybody have synapses that are firing? Good morning, Mike. I'm glad your synapses are firing. That's a good thing. Jörn, are you adequately caffeinated yet?
I'm here. Good morning, everyone. And I realized that live podcast isn't always, it sounded fun, but it's tough. I'm a little tired, I have to say. Anyways, looking forward to this recording.
Ian, how are you doing this morning?
Yeah, good morning. I'm pretty good. I said to Roger when I bumped into him earlier in the week that even before the invitation for this arrived, I remember that I agreed to it, and I'd been dreaming about the invitation arriving for a podcast at 6:15 in the AM. And I was completely confused because I couldn't find the invitation that I dreamt about in my email, and I thought that possibly it was never going to happen. But here we are, 6:15.
Yes, we are, 6:15. And Ian, thanks for doing this. Jörn, people have been asking me how I got anybody to do this, and I've been telling them that you've alleged that my superpower is my ability to shame people into things. I think Ian would be the example of that this morning. So just for our audience, this is, as I say, 6:15 in the morning in Vienna, early morning, crack of dawn in Europe, and midnight on the East Coast in the United States, and it's still Thursday in the rest of North America, well, I guess except for Newfoundland and the Atlantic provinces in Canada. We're going to do this one now. We're going to talk about the first 3 days of the conference. We're not going to talk at all in this podcast about the nomenclature, because that's later this morning, and we'll be getting into that. Besides my joke about the Steatotic Tsunami, which I can't even say once quickly at this hour of the morning. But a tremendous amount's happened in the last 3 days, and we're going to take about the next hour, and we're going to go over that. We'll come from very different perspectives, obviously. Mike Betel is a patient advocate and not a science guy at all, although he does come out of pharma. I'm kind of self-taught, and Jörn and Ian are prominent key opinion leaders who've led events here and given talks and all that good stuff. So why don't we start with this? Just really simply, one of the things I asked you gents to do was to open with general impressions. And what I'd like to ask you each to do is give me a word or a short phrase with no elaboration that describes your impression of this conference so far. And then we'll go back and elaborate on how you got there. Then we'll talk about what I think is the most important paper of the conference, Stephen Harrison's presentation of the MAESTRO-NASH data on Thursday morning at the general session. discussion, and then we'll talk about things that we each found interesting and important. So, one word or one phrase that captures your general feeling about this meeting. Bold one, go first.
I haven't said so much at this point, and it might be that I'm a little tired, but I'll start with excitement. I came in feeling a little nervous about, how we're going to do this. There's the nomenclature debate today, or discussion, and of course, big data being presented. I myself had some presentations, so I think I went in with excitement.
Mike, go ahead. Take a sentence.
No, we're not describing it now, right? We're waiting until after.
No, but given that Jörn cheated, if you want to describe it, so take a minute and do that.
I can't say things in one word.
There goes the plan.
Well, okay, so no, Mike, why don't you be the good boy and stick with the plan, and we'll come back to why you said exhilarating in a minute. Ian?
Hot.
Yeah. Particularly for those of us from the U.S. who are in unair-conditioned hotels, really hot. I think mine is going to be energizing, which is a little different than exhilarating, and I'll come back to why in a minute. But so, Mike, since you were bold enough to go second, why don't you talk about why exhilarating?
Well, for me, I guess I draw this meeting sort of proves I am an extrovert, I guess, because I drew a lot of energy from the people that we talked to and then we met with. I just loved every second of it. I couldn't stop. I think I could have said adrenaline rush, but that wasn't one word. But it was really fun. Enjoyed it a lot. I'm still enjoying it. We still got another half day here.
But now, for those of you who are not on LinkedIn, I've lost count, but Mike must have posted at least 25 videos on LinkedIn in the first 3 days of this meeting. Everywhere he goes, he pulls out his phone, he posts a video, he does another one. The most infamous being the one where my hair was blowing sideways across my head, and I literally looked at the camera and said, oh my God, look at my hair. But he's been doing that all through, and it's been great. It's been a lot of fun.
I love that. Jörn's laughing. I don't know if it's too much or just enough, but I figure if people don't want to see it, they just scroll up.
Yeah, that's been great. So Ian, you chose hot, which I'm assuming was in one part about the weather, but was it only about the weather?
No, I think it describes a bit of the, of the way the data at the meeting feel, hot off the press. And in some cases, really quite hot in terms of how interesting and exciting they are. And I guess we'll dig into some of those presentations as we go through. But it really has been temperature hot too. As I came in my suit on Thursday to chair a session, I wondered whether I really should have been wearing my swimming shorts and being on holiday rather than in a suit working. But I think maybe that's I was more accustomed to the rain that we had last night.
And actually, the rain was really welcome. In fact, I usually don't like getting caught out in the rain without an umbrella, but last night it was a delight to do that or to have that happen. Here's why I said energizing. First, I think everything everyone said is correct. A tremendous amount of really exciting presentations and a lot of ferment. And I go back to NASH Tech 2019, the first time I was in this space, when people spent 2 days trying to figure out how do you get a one-level regression of fibrosis in a clinical trial. And we are so far beyond that now in so many different directions, in breadth, in depth, in the questions we're asking. But also, you can start to see where big debates are boiling up. And the papers I chose to talk about this morning are going to be around the issue of AI and the 8 different definitions, figurative, but the 3 or 4 very different ways that people are describing AI right now, and how I think that will potentially come into conflict. And you can see a competitive dynamic and an intellectual dynamic setting up. And it's not just about that. It's also about drug choices and all kinds of things where people are coming forth with enough data now that you can really see this in different ways. And folks did that. I think it's fantastic. I love a good debate. So with that, we'll go back to bold one. Let's spend a little bit of time on resmetirom. Okay. Ian, in what I think was one of the interesting cheats of this year, decided that when we did the preview, he went first and he said, well, I'll just say resmetirom is really exciting, which got him out of having to take a stand on anything. But I'll go back to you now. Seeing it presented and watching how the room and the meeting reacted, how did that strike you?
It was really good to see the data in a bit more depth than we'd seen in the press release, and it confirms the way that I think about it, which is that the efficacy is good. It's met both of the registrational endpoints, I think, and the safety profile is confirmed as being good enough. It's not a massive data set. It's bigger than previous data sets because they've had parallel studies where they've accumulated additional safety data and supportive efficacy data. I think it'll probably be enough to cross the threshold with the regulators for conditional licensing. I was sort of struck that I guess it didn't have the same excitement and buzz around it in the room as it did in the days of hepatitis C. And maybe that's just a bar that's too high, and that we should stop comparing to what happened in 2010 and 11 and 12 for how we should feel and how we should respond to high quality and really quite compelling data. I guess that novelty was still missing. And the thing that I think supports that a little bit is that I was kind of expecting that we would see the manuscript at the same time, big splash, New England Journal presentation, same day. And we haven't seen that. So I guess I was left wanting just a little bit more.
That's interesting. I don't know about you folks, but when I look for, in terms of the efficacy profile and everything else, when I think in the context of Hep-C, I go back to interferon and ribavirin, maybe a little better than that. But this certainly isn't Harvoni and Sovaldi in terms of efficacy. And I mean, the disease is more complex and the drug isn't as efficacious or is as simple a choice.
Roger, and Ian, I was there for Intron A for hepatitis, and it was like, Gary Davis, 50% response, 50% relapse, but there was no RNA. They were using ALTs as a marker. And it got approved. So, to me, these are like twice that. Sure, you guys are getting tired of the new data, but remember, you're right to bring back what it was like for decades. So.
Okay, Jörn, thoughts about resmetirom?
I'm trying to think. We want a lot at this time. It's a chronic disease we're not going to get cure for. So I felt it was a pretty compelling data set. I agree that we've kind of seen the data through the press release, which is always a spoiler. But then with the presentation, it was a little bit more in-depth. It was, reflecting, it was 990 patients, roughly, I think a little less. 60% were F3, advanced fibrosis. So these are pre-cirrhotic patients. And if you crank up their thyroid hormone receptors activation in the liver, they start to lose fibrosis and steatohepatitis resolution. So it met both endpoints. I thought that was also interesting. Again, the delta over placebo, 20% for the NASH resolution, 12, I think, for the fibrosis regression. Both doses worked. I thought that was interesting. So now we have a drug with 2 efficacious doses. What are we going to do? We're going to use 80 or 100. And they showed, and I guess I'm part of the co-authors, is the doses didn't differ so much in terms of different subgroups that they looked at. So it kind of went the same direction in all subcategories that were explored. The safety profile was good. I mean, we've seen a drug now being not approved for the safety profile, so that one was tick the box, and it's an oral. So it's quite an advancement for us.
I couldn't agree more. And when I mentioned interferon and ribavirin, actually where I was going to was, if you think about what Hep-C was before that was considered quite an advance at the time, primitive compared to what we do now. And I'd like to think that if we go forward 12 years in steatotic liver disease, or whatever we're going to call this, we will look back and say that this was a good start, but primitive compared to where we are 12 years from now. For that reason, one of the undertones was that, unfortunately, towards the latter part of the OCA FDA AdCom, some of the people on the panel started questioning the efficacy endpoint. And I believe that until the day this drug gets approved, many people will be at least a little bit fearful that they might do that again. I'm not particularly fearful. First of all, OCA only hit one endpoint, not both, on efficacy. And second, the safety issues were far worse. And third, DILI is a real issue, particularly if you have a drug that's going to go out to primary care. Because I had this conversation, actually, when we talked about it on the podcast, in the episode, we talked about how Jörn and Manal Abdulmalik, Manal actually being the person who testified to this during the comments hour, could probably handle anything that they saw with an OCA patient, but a primary care doc probably couldn't. And one of the things I heard this week, it might have been from one of you two guys, Ian Rowe, it might have been from somebody else, is that the advisors who were working with Intercept suggested that they take a far less ambitious pose to the FDA, talk a lot more about safety, talk a lot more about DILI, talk a lot more about, REMS strategies, and that the commercial people chose not to do that because they wanted broad labeling. If that's true, I don't know that it is, I've only heard it, but that would have meant they overplayed their hand. I believe that Madrigal will be a lot smarter about this. I was talking with Madrigal people at this meeting who said that Becky Taub's level of caution around what they will and won't say about the drug befits an appreciation that first it's got to get approved, and that overstatement before approval doesn't help you at FDA. So I believe they will play it really well from here on out, and I believe their data is good enough. Until it's over the line, I think people are just going to have some concerns.
Roger, I was going to say the exact same thing, that it's a cautious optimism, I think. The data looks good, but I think people are afraid exactly what you just said. That it might happen again. And so from that patient perspective too. So I also spoke at the FDA and the ICER, and so there were issues to talk about there. So I think hopefully this will be better.
I hope so. Actually, I feel really good for Stephen Harrison. When his last line, which is the thing I think he's been dying to say for as long as I've known him, was that we now have a drug that appears to make a positive contribution. It was premature for a victory lap, but it certainly felt like a victory statement.
I was waiting for him to say, and this is going to make a big fat dent on fatty liver disease. I would have loved that in the session.
I think that's the level of optimism he didn't want to go to. And if he did, I think Becky would have probably come on the stage and stepped on his foot. Not because it's not right, Jörn. I think it is, but I think, we'd be a little careful for a minute. No, first of all, I think you're right. I think it'll be a big fat dent. I just don't think you claim it until after it gets approved. But I think also, by the way, that set the tone for the entire meeting. First talk of general session and just left everybody feeling a lot better. At least that was my sense.
No, I agree. I think it started off well. So let's move on, because I thought there was a lot of very interesting additional things.
Since you volunteered, why don't you go first?
So a personal highlight that I was going to share with you, and I think Michael was there, we had a session on challenges in screening on alcoholic and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We had 4 participants in that session yesterday. Maya Thiele, who unfortunately couldn't attend, patient representative, and 2 colleagues, Peter Jepson, among others, and Ivana Draganovic, the ALPA patient representative. She actually showed the Surfing the NASH tsunami in her slides. She pulled out this as an example of patient contribution to the field, and I wanted to share that with you here on the podcast. I think that was a great thing. Michael, you saw that?
Yes, I was going to comment on 2 of the presentations from that group, but it's kind of cool to see the world come together in this way.
The room was packed. And there were about, I'm going to guess, 50 to 75 people out in the hall watching the whole thing on screen. I know that because that's where I saw it from. Frankly, the rooms were too hot for me to go. I mean, Mike wanted me to sit in the front row with him, but after a while, those rooms were just hot enough that I wanted to be out in the hall so I could breathe.
It's usually easy to get the front row, Roger.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so I resisted the urge to show any reaction when she did that. And I wasn't with anybody who knew me, so nobody turned around and pointed. If I'd been in the front row with Mike, it might have been different. But yeah, that was fantastic. I love that moment. I agree. And I love that presentation.
So Jörn brought up a good point about Maya. I mean, she was on the screen because she couldn't be there, but she talked about the challenges that GPs, because that was like the title of it, the primary care physicians were having. There's a bit of fatigue out there about telling people their lifestyle changes. So you have to lose some weight and you have to exercise more, and that they may not want to do anymore until a drug is approved. So the whole discussion we just had is important in a lot of ways.
Okay, Ian, go next, and then Mike, and then I'll go.
Yeah, one final comment on that screening session, and particularly around those primary care aspects. And we're in deep conversation with colleagues locally and across the UK about what primary care want to do. And one of the things that they feel is that extended testing strategies, which is kind of what we've developed in Leeds, which is stepwise, requires quite a lot of primary care, is actually preventing them doing that lifestyle intervention and trying to optimally manage comorbidities. They feel that they're doing too much testing and not enough action. So I think it's quite interesting to hear those different perspectives, because I think they recognise that maybe a drug treatment's going to be quite a long way from the vast majority of patients with whatever we're going to call it from 10 o'clock. It's quite a different perspective to some of the things that Maya was saying, and I think it's important that we see that tension.
Interesting.
You look like you want to say.
Yeah, I do actually, because I'm running around to the other side of this table, and I'm thinking that NHS, right, has announced in the last several months that they're about to invest a ton of money in 25 community FibroScan centers, and that NICE is now going to reimburse. And I just feel like the UK is out ahead on this. I know that in the UK it's popular to bash the NHS for not being ahead on anything, particularly among voters, if not among medical professionals. I just think you guys are out ahead. You're doing a lot of very smart things about it. I think that's an interesting comment, and I think we're going to be looking to the UK for a lot of leadership on this, frankly. I think
that's probably fair, and everybody criticises NHS England, but they have pushed the agenda on testing for liver disease, and it's interesting that it's really to increase the early diagnosis of liver cancer. That's been the lever that's actually changed the way that the NHS is approaching it, but there's a lot of initiatives that are running now to try and increase diagnosis, and that'll have benefits for all patients with liver disease, not just those who've got advanced disease.
So, Jörn, do I recall correctly that when Jeff published his first survey of all the different countries in terms of preparedness, that nobody did well, but UK was number one at that point? I think they got a 50 and nobody else even got that high. Do I recall that correctly?
I think it was India, to tell you the truth, because they have a NASH guidance document. But I'm sure the UK was better than
India and UK were the two. I don't remember. I thought UK was ahead of India. It might have been the other way around, but they were the two. And UK's taken a whole bunch of steps since then.
Yeah, and I would agree on that in terms of the alignment of the pathways. And because one of the presentations that we also showed is that even if we identify patients with an imperfect test in Germany, 50% don't show up for their secondary screening test. And that's like we miss to link the patients to care.
Although, frankly, I think having a drug is really going to help with that, right? Because every time I've ever interviewed physicians, look, back in the days of diabetes, we still have diabetes, but before we had the GLP-1s and the SGLT2s, when all you had was metformin and the sulfonylureas, you'd interview physicians for marketing research, and their level of frustration with what they couldn't get their patients to do bordered on contempt. And I think that's actually gotten better as the drugs have gotten better. Not that the patients are doing better, but at least doctors feel now they can start to see some success in glycohemoglobin and things like that. So I believe that having drugs will make everything flow smoother.
I agree. Well, not much else to say with that. It's funny. I'm sitting here as you're talking, and I'm thinking about Jörn saying how many great things he still wants to cover in this conversation, and that we have the time left. And it's like, why are we talking about this? Let Jörn say what he wants to say.
Well, we've all got things we want to say, and actually, Ian goes next, and then I go after that, and then we'll come back to Jörn. And I have some things I really do want to talk about too. So that's good. Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to circle to where Jörn, I think, was probably going to go to, which was the NAFL therapy session yesterday morning, and to highlight the two GLP-1 glucagon co-agonists, and the first one, pegtide, which I've just about learned to say now, and then pemvidutide. And somebody said to me yesterday afternoon about, how these treatments would be used and the possibility of the cure of NASH, which I do think is an optimistic idea, but drugs that showed a relatively high rate of complete resolution of fat in the liver. Now, what that really means for patients in the longer term, and how tolerable these drugs will be in the longer term, and what would happen if the drugs are stopped, and all of those questions remain. But this idea that you can, achieve huge reductions in liver fat content readily and quickly is really striking. And, these drugs become more and more efficacious in that regard, at least. And I think it's encouraging to see that. And I guess my level of excitement around those is probably, or perhaps a bit more than it was around the Madrigal data, because you can see such huge changes. It gives real optimism for what's going to be possible in the future for patients who've got particularly other metabolic conditions too.
I'd agree with Ian that I said the second wave of drugs we're seeing now, this is not like we only have one drug that's been presented and now we go back to being frustrated. This is the second wave that comes in and really has strong efficacy effects. So I agree with Ian. I think this is a very, very exciting field.
I completely agree. And, we've been watching, this was the first time we saw the Merck drug. And I thought it was actually a relevant comment that using SEMA-1 as a comparator without a placebo made it a little hard to figure out exactly how good the drug is, right? Because it's a suboptimal dose of SEMA. It's a dose nobody uses of SEMA, really. You could have defended 1.2. I don't know how you defend 1. But clearly it's an exciting drug. And we've been watching pemvidutide come through literally from phase 1. So it keeps showing these same results over and over again. I think that's really exciting.
Just on that topic, there was a bit of, contention's too strong for this morning, but there was an issue with the dosage. Then you just kind of glossed over it. But is that an issue that it was the 1 milligram that was used as a comparator?
I just think it makes it hard to figure out exactly how good it is. The phrase I use in situations like that, it's like trying to beat up on the little sisters of the poor. SEMA-1 is a suboptimal dose, and there was no placebo. So we know we know it's good. We don't know how good it is, would be my point. I don't think it's a problem per se, Mike, only if you're trying to compare it.
Well, this is what the media actually picked up. That's what they said. They actually said, I saw it in the news already, saying that it may not be what it appears to be, that kind of thing. So
it's interesting. They picked it up because a colleague also kind of phrased this it wasn't aggressive, but strongly. So I think that was one of the notions that hang around. And the company wanted to show a benefit, so they choose this. Maybe retrospect wasn't the greatest comparator. On the other hand, this is not a GLP-1, but this is a GLP-1 plus, and this is the context of. So the concept is that we have something that happens in the liver through the glucagon receptors, and I think Ian pinpointed it when he said, this melts the fat in the liver away, and something we don't see with the GLP-1s by themselves. And even the higher dose of GLP-1 would have been my expectation, wouldn't have done it to the same extent. So I think those extended GLP-1 agonisms are really something we will be looking out for in the future for the liver-specific effect.
And by the way, looming behind all this is a triple agonist from Hanmi in South Korea. I know Hanmi has arrangements with Merck on a couple of things. I don't know if the triple agonist is part of it, but they've been putting up posters at every meeting for the last year and a half, and their numbers dwarf pemvidutide. 90% reductions in 50% or more of patients. It's crazy numbers. So I think that's going to be a majorly promising therapeutic class as we go forward, certainly for anybody who is not yet cirrhotic.
The big questions then will be around tolerability, because the addition of another agonist just seemed to add a bit more in terms of side effects, and there were quite a number of patients with abdominal pain, which I think for a disease that's otherwise not completely asymptomatic but largely symptom-free, and for therapies that are going to be taken in not for very short duration, those sorts of issues will become more relevant, but we need to see bigger studies and over a longer duration to really understand how that's going to work.
I agree, and here's the flip side on that, right? SEMA-1 might not have the same side effect profile that you see with SEMA 2.4. So we know that SEMA has, gastric distress issues. And you take a look and you say, oh my gosh, this is worse. But is it worse than 2.4? We don't know.
So within that presentation, we saw two more. There's a time-restricted feeding, which wasn't medical. I use that concept, so I'm somewhat excited of it. And going back to the pharmacological treatments, the fatty acid synthase inhibitors, we've seen some data in earlier meetings. And then there was the novel concept to use RNA interference. And I think this is also something that could come on strong. The genetic targets, totally different MOA. They pretty much showed the phase 1 data in 2 parts, small study for tolerability, and then actually a 12-month or even a little longer study with 46 patients and 3 liver biopsies. And the numbers that resonated with me was knockdown of the target by 60 or 70% at 6 months after 3 doses. And I think it was still down to 30% after 2 doses. Yeah.
2 doses. There was a dose right after the initial biopsy. There was a dose at 3 months, and that was it.
2 doses. You're right. At 12 months. So that's interesting, and it's long lasting.
Agreed. And now that concept's been around for a little bit. I mean, someone had a year and a half ago, maybe a small company, I think Arrowhead maybe, or Arrowwood, I forget what the exact name, had a late breaker poster of distinction on exactly the same topic. And I know because that AZ is, or AZ, depending on which side of the pond you live on, is heading into phase 2B with a genetic product targeted specifically at PNPLA3, and are earlier in the pathway with one at HSN1713. And they're not alone. Novo bought a miRNA company a while ago, and the product that they showed, I talked about this in the product that they showed came from alnilam. It's basically the same strategy that they used to create inclisiran for cholesterol reduction, where they're getting roughly PCSK9 level reductions with 2 doses a year. So I think there's real magic there, potentially. Do we have anything else you want to say about drugs? Because I want to go on to other stuff.
The only thing I was going to say, we did a secondary analysis of efruxifermin data showing the response of biomarkers in relation to histological improvement, and it was selected as a top poster. It's presented yesterday. I thought that to get the effect size in relation to histological improvement from different drug trials will help us for the future, because now we're at a point where we hopefully will have a drug, and then we got to know, what does it mean if an NIT changes under therapy? To what extent? We continue the treatment, and do we stop the treatment? Is this efficacious for the patient or not? So I think those type of analysis moving forward will be very crucial for us to make decisions.
Agree. And pegozafermin, which is the 89 bio FGF21, is one of the late breakers today. So it'll be intriguing to see how that comes out as well, and whether they talk about any of that in that presentation. So in my advanced write-up about this conference, I described it as the coming out party for Nail on IT, but I think that's accurate. And there was a session Thursday afternoon. Naim and then Mazen presented 2 papers out of the Nail on IT consortium, and Jörn had been saying a couple of months ago that you thought Nail on IT was about to start to bear some significant fruit, and I think we saw a lot of that here. And the idea that every time they put up a slide, they talk about the idea that goes, we're going to try to go straight past biopsy to outcomes, which is the strategy, is I think an important thing to socialize. Jörn, would you say anything about the data that Naim and Mazen were presenting, since I know that you're a significant part of all that?
Yeah, so the Nail on IT consortium combined screening data from 6 interventional phase 2 trials to correlate, again, it's kind of the same story as I just detailed, liver histology with biomarkers. Naim showed performance in the AGA pathway, and a little bit expected if you have an enriched clinical trial population, and that was also shown for the Madrigal population earlier. The non-invasive referral tests we're using are not the greatest to identify patients, and actually quite some are in the low FIB4 category and still have significant disease. But this is not the way we are using FIB4, and Ian's done a lot of work on that. It's something that is, I think, overplaying its ability in those enriched populations. And then the data Mazen showed, again, related to changes or to vibration-controlled transient elastography. Again, we haven't seen data from that many patients, and Nail on IT is going to grow. So I think we'll exceed 10,000 patients with liver biopsies. So for that, it's a unique cohort that we're going to study NITs in.
The point that Jörn makes about the enriched population means that the messages that you take from the consortium in terms of the screening aspects, really are inapplicable to the way that many people are using those tests in primary care. There's very much questions about enrolling patients in trials, and understanding that difference in context of use, I think, is really important for people, because there's a risk otherwise that you look at the Nail on IT data and think, oh, we've got our thresholds all wrong. And I don't think we have. And, there were data presented from secondary care cohorts in a couple of poster sessions where the liver outcomes in people who've got low FIB4 are extremely rare. And if we're going to get away from tying non-invasive tests to histology and instead tie them to outcomes, then that's what we have to remember. And I think it's important that people understand that the populations are very different and the implications of the studies then are also different.
Agreed. And there's work you've done and also work, I guess, that John Lynch has done in UK also that take a look at screening strategies for a broader population that might be a more efficient way to get to the right target patients. But that's not by throwing out FIB4. It's simply by trying to enhance a little bit, take advantage of what it does well, and then enhance. And I think that's the strategy we should all be looking at in the long run, I believe.
I was just going to add that any alternative to biopsies in the real world is something that everybody wants to move towards, I think clinicians and patients. And so any of the work that they keep sharing on successes and who to do which NIT with helps.
Yeah, and I think even, by the way, in the U.S., I think payers don't necessarily have a strong appetite to demand biopsy. And that was a fear 3 years ago, but I don't think that's how it's going to emerge. I could be wrong. But I don't anticipate that we're going to see thousands of people have to get biopsies, or millions of people literally to get biopsies in order to get on drug. And that would be a good thing, I think. The one other thing I want to make sure we touched on this morning is the whole issue of artificial intelligence, which is a rubric that is applied far too widely to far too many different kinds of things. But I think we're starting to see some contours emerge for where the debate might be. I had said in the preview that I was really intrigued to see the PathAIM paper that Stephen was going to be presenting as part of that session on Thursday afternoon, because Stephen has touted that as being the most likely way to get beyond biopsy in clinical trial for FDA. That might be right, but I think I had hoped for a little more. I mean, Vlad Ratsiu made the comment on question that I think I agreed with, which is that if all we are doing here is using the same slides and the same metrics, but doing a better job of reducing variance in ordinal measures, that probably underplays what we can achieve with the technology. Ian and I were standing outside yesterday afternoon together when Tim Kendall from Edinburgh put up a different paper which took a look at second harmonic generation convergence stuff from HistoIndex, Truth in Packaging, their client on the podcast. But I thought it was a different thing. But I'm not sure people, I don't know what you felt, I felt people didn't exactly understand exactly what they were looking at. And a 15-minute presentation is a lot to capture. But
it is. I think we've had this conversation on the podcast before, but my personal view is that the inter and intra-reader variability is less important than the sampling variability. And we showed that, I think, at least quite compellingly in a paper that we published last year about interpretation of placebo responses in clinical trials. And I think the technologies will really help if they can reduce that sampling variability by providing a sort of a more holistic read on fibrosis. If you can, interpret what you've got in your single slide better, more clearly, then I think that will help. I mean, the decision support that the PathAI tool gives is only as good as the annotations that it was provided with, and the quality of the data that you saw, supported that, because you had really good outcomes for steatosis and fibrosis, and less good for ballooning and inflammation, where I guess where it's harder.
I'm going to ask Jörn or Mike if either one of you ever thought about that, because I could we're now in statistics, so we're kind of in my zone. I could talk about this forever. I'm going to try not to.
I think it'll also help us to understand the disease progression and potentially regression better, because it's not about the way we categorize this in a 5-tier NASH CRN system. I think the AI will support us on deciphering how fibrosis in the middle of the lobule zone 2 does look like, and how that could contribute to the disease stage versus the portal tract fibrosis, for example. So I think the ability to more precisely localize fibers and look at the completeness of bridging or scarring is going to help us to see some early signs of efficacy.
Agree. And so one of the concerns I've got about all this is that I've heard AI as a concept used to describe 4 different phenomena in the space we're dealing in right now, right? The PathAI approach, which is, can we simply reduce variance around the measures we're using now to get drugs approved? The second harmonic, which is, I think, what Ian and then Jörn have described, the ability to get a much clearer view of the liver and to get cleaner stories about what's going on. And then I'll run around to the other side. I mean, Alina Allen was telling me that she's got her model up, and that's a model of how to use EHR in a machine learning context to do a better job of identifying patients who need to get treated who aren't getting treated. And if you go across the pond, Predictive Health, who's been on this podcast, are doing the same thing, but they they explicitly say this is not AI. We're just looking at some very simple measures and we're making it work. So I think certainly in the U.S., we have a tendency to try to make everything as technological as possible because we think somehow that makes it automatically better. And our healthcare system in this country is full of spending way too much money to solve problems where if we did things like taught people to eat better, we might not have. Whereas the rest of the world, there are great talks about things like alcohol labeling and food package labeling. And in the U.S., we're having fights about corporations have the right to free speech. So if I want to call my product with 16 grams of sugar healthy cereal, I can do that. And you can't stop me, FDA. So that's a very American approach. But I'd like to think that what we can find is efficient solutions that educate us on things that really matter. And there, I think this entire AI ML field has tremendous potential if it's used right. I'm just concerned that we will get confused about the terms and what we're trying to do and either overrepresent what's possible.
Hey, Roger, I was going to talk a little bit about like Stephen Harrison has always said, for years about that pathology intervariability of results and the fact that AI could, now eliminate that. But there was also discussions at the conference about not letting AI make the decisions for the physician. And if we ever get to the point that physicians don't have that input themselves, it's going to be an issue. You were there for that one or two times.
Look, we have two physicians in this conference and you and I are neither of them. I'm not particularly concerned about it evolving that way, but I really want to know what Jörn and Ian think.
So there are I am sure there are circumstances where algorithms will make better decisions than doctors. And the fibrosis testing arena is probably one of those. In terms of consistency and probably accuracy, algorithms in that setting will, I think, probably outperform physicians because we'll begin to look at information that's probably less relevant. I'm not concerned, I have to say, about the necessarily complete digital computer read versus a pathologist read. Assuming that the model's well trained and is accurate, then I think that would be fine.
I think we cannot have machines start talking to convey diagnoses or give something automated to the patient. We need the personal interaction. But if we get help interpreting a lot of data that we can grasp ourselves in the available time, I think that's the way forward.
Completely agree with both those comments. And the cautionary note, by the way, which is another definition of AI, is generative AI and the increasing understanding that it can reinforce stereotypes and drive its own algorithms in really bad directions if not managed by people as we go along.
Roger, so it's funny. I just thought of something like that from what Ian said. This is not AI related, but it is FIB4 related, that there are physicians, a lot of people are saying, why does a primary care physician have to take time out of all the patients are seeing to calculate the FIB4 when it should be on the blood, when you're doing sending in the blood work to get it back that way? So that's just one example of a technological advantage. You don't have to sit and do that manually.
Yeah, but that's not AI, right?
I said that, but I'm giving an even more primitive example that's saying we're already dealing with that. People are already moving towards not having to do things manually themselves.
Completely agree. I guess it's probably time for us to wrap this conversation up because at least Jörn and Ian need to get over to the hall for things at 8 o'clock. I have a little more leeway, but that's okay. So in closing, was there a moment in the last 3 days that you had a reaction you really didn't expect, either viscerally or intellectually, to something you saw?
For me, it's easy. You did an interview with Tatiana from Ukraine, and it just hit me hard. And when she said that they had to train people to avoid landmines and to wear bulletproof vests when they want to go in to see patients, that was like, oh my God, that's dedication.
Yeah, let me suggest that everyone who's listening to this should go back and find that interview. I was astonished.
He's still speechless.
Which is really unusual for me. So you know how that came about. The press people for EASL also work with the major HIV initiatives in Europe. And before the war, she was the coordinator for HIV programs in Ukraine. And the funny thing about that is I think that moment affected everybody in the meeting. It reminded us all what our sense of purpose is.
And the fact that we can have solidarity on, if we can do that, we can do other things like patient care and NASH and NAFLD, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Other moments, Ian, Jörn?
The thing that struck me most, actually, was the Nail and IT presentations. I had a bit of a response to those because the population is so different and some of the approaches that were used I felt were perhaps not that applicable. Fagan's nomogram, which perhaps very few people who are listening will be familiar with, but actually where the pretest probability of diagnosis is already high, it's probably not the best place to be using that sort of approach. And we've learned a lot about how trials are interpreted, but I think there's still a gap about interpretation of biomarkers and populations, contexts of use. And I think there's probably a need for the community to be able to understand that a bit more clearly and to be able to share that knowledge more widely.
So first of all, Ian, on the one hand, I agree. But the thing about this nail NIT that's important is keeping it in context. And the proper context for nail NIT is that all the other developed work on how to go beyond biopsy in clinical trials has started with you how to prove yourself against the biopsy. And I've used this example on this podcast a bunch of times, but they were never able to get a generic for Premarin, despite the fact that it was a 60-year-old drug selling $2 billion a year in the U.S. And the reason is because the bioavailability was so erratic that you couldn't get a generic because the generics could not be made to be as erratic as Premarin was. So if you think of nail NIT in the context of trying to come up with a way not to have to use biopsy in the trial process, then I think you appreciate the tremendous leap forward that can be made by skipping the step that goes compare it to biopsy. That said, as I said about AI, I'm very afraid that people are going to misinterpret phrases and use them in really bad ways. That's another point of the same thing. If you start to use the enriched nail NIT populations to decide how you want to screen frontline in primary care offices, that's going to be not a good thing.
Yeah, and I totally agree with the potential for nail NIT in the longer term to be able to do that, to move beyond the biopsy. And I think we all agree. I think the whole community, apart from the regulators, agrees that that is the right direction of travel. And I've got absolutely no issues with that because I think it's a really rational approach. They're high quality data sets and they're enriched for advanced disease where there will be events over time. So definitely the right place to look. It's about how we understand the data that they present now just to inform those other strategies.
Yeah, I believe there's going to be general challenge as we go forward about making sure that everybody learns the right lessons and doesn't neither over nor under interprets things that are going to come forward. I couldn't agree with you more about that. Any other closing thoughts? You're uncharacteristically quiet. Not that you're not quiet, but you're quiet for you.
It's early. No, we have another half a day, and we're going to see a late breaker today. And the ASLD deadlines is passed, so we're going to meet again in November and see where this brings us. Actually, the one thing that I kind of regret is actually ADA is happening at the same time, and I just saw another press release of a compound survodutide being efficacious in obesity. It's a drug that's a dual agonist, and I think the momentum in the field is strong, and we're going to see some concepts. Those will be beneficial for liver health, and I'm just very excited to be here at this time point and develop those medications and NITs for our patients.
Totally agree with you about ADA. Mike, you have anything you want to add? And then I'll wrap up by telling our audience what's coming next on this podcast. Okay, there will be no business section today, so I'm going to give you the whole business section right now. We are going off to the conference this morning. Mike and I will be back later today. We will not be with Ian and Jörn, who have things they have to do in the afternoon, but we will be joined by Jeff McIntyre from Global Liver Institute. And happily, we will have two KOLs. Hannes Hagström will be with us, and Michelle Long, who was an academic KOL and is now a leading researcher at Novo Nordisk, but highly respected and a fantastic contributor and KOL in her own right. So we will be back talking, the five of us, in about 6 hours about what actually came out of the meeting. Ken Kusi is organizing a group of folks who are at ADA to record an episode late next week that we'll be posting around July 4th or July 5th that will talk about the highlights at that meeting so that we can bring that information to our audience, even though obviously none of us are there. So with that, let me thank Ian and Jörn and Mike for getting up at this ridiculous hour to do this. And I should really feel guilty about this, but I don't, because Jörn's right. My ability to shame self-consciously without self-consciousness is a superpower of sorts. And thank you guys so much for coming with us. And I'll see you over in the hall a little bit later. And to our audience, we'll be back to you guys later. Stay safe and surf on. Thanks.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye-bye now.
This concludes episode 29, today's first real-time coverage from the EASL Congress 2023.
As Roger said during the episode, there will be no business report.
We will share episode 30 with Mike Betel, Hannes Hagström, Michelle Long, and Jeff McIntyre later today.
Until then, as Roger likes to say, stay safe and surf on. Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.